All right, I hope you guys are enjoying this series, this playlist so far. And in this video, let's start with application code changes, but this is a very small section. And I think the remaining sections are also pretty small. So rather than creating separate videos for each of the remaining sections, we are going to try to cover the rest of this article in this video and try to wrap it up. So application code changes. Once you've selected your multi-tenant strategy in every layer, let's start considering what is needed to change at the code level in terms of the code changes. If you decided to adopt Django from Python for your SaaS application, then you need to do a few tweaks to align your current application with your multi-tenant architecture. From the database and application layer, fortunately, web languages and frameworks are able to capture the URL or subdomain that is coming from the request. And so the ability to obtain this information subdomain at runtime is critical to handling dynamic subdomains for your multi-tenant architecture. And we won't cover in depth what lines of code we need to include in your Django application or in any other framework, but at least let you know that what items should be considered in this section. So Python Django multi-tenancy in a nutshell. Add an app called Tenant.py, a class for tenant-aware model with multiple pool classes. And how do you identify tenants? You need to give each tenant a subdomain. To do so, you need to modify a few DNS changes, Nginx Apache tweaks, and add a utility method, utils.py. And now whenever you get a request, you can use this method to figure out the tenant and then determine how to extract the tenant using the host header, the subdomain, and isolate the administration. And so previous code suggestions could change depending on the architecture that you're using. Next, let's talk about the wildcard DNS subdomain, URL-based SaaS platform. Basically, every organization has its own subdomain, and they are quite useful for identifying the different organizations per tenant, and it is a unique dedicated space, environment, and custom application, at least logically, for example, org1.sas.com, org2.sas.com, and so on. And this kind of URL structure will dynamically provision your SaaS multi-tenant application, and this DNS change will facilitate the identification, authentication, authorization of every tenant. And another workaround that's possible is the path-based per tenant. So it's not really recommended. Subdomains is the better way to go. But if you were doing the path-based thing, then you would do your domain / the tenant org1, org2, and that so on. So the path-based thing is not recommended because that's usually used for API to do versioning and to give APIs the flexibility to do the paths rather than stick the organizations in the path. The following is required in this particular section: a wildcard record that should be in place for managing your DNS records. The wildcard subdomain redirects all your routes to your multi-tenant architecture, either to the load balancer, application server, or cluster endpoint. The CNAME record should be pointing to your correct app or login, and asterisk means a wildcard to your app domain. And as a final step, another A record pointing to your app domain, to your Amazon ECS cluster, ALB, or load balancer, or IP. So, and also, the DNS record entries would be like star.sas.com with the CNAME mapping to app.sas.com, or app.sas.com with the A record 1234, your IP address basically, or the app.sas.com with an alias to a load balancer, and so on. So this is basically your DNS records that you need to manage when building. The next piece is the web server setup with Nginx configuration. So Moving down to your web server, to the Nginx, you need to configure your Nginx configuration and the server blocks, your virtual hosts. You need to set up the wildcard vhost for your Nginx web server. Make sure it's an alias and a catch-all wildcard site. You don't have to create a subdomain virtual host in Nginx per tenant. Instead, you need to set up a single wildcard virtual host for all of your tenants. So you don't have to create like 10,000 virtual hosts. You need to figure out, have some sort of a pattern matching and match that to your virtual host configuration in your Nginx or Apache. And naturally, the wildcard pattern will match the subdomains and route to the correct application document root. So yeah, there are other articles where you can look at, how do you actually work with Nginx or Apache virtual hosts if that's something that you need to learn more about. But that's what you want to do when it comes to doing multi-tenancy. SSL certificates, don't forget to deal with those for the different tenant subdomains. You would need to add them either in your CDN, your load balancer, or web server. And this can be accomplished using your Apache web server as well. You need to follow the 12-factor methodology framework, which basically represents the pure DevOps and cloud native principles, including the immutable infrastructure, dev test, prod, parity with Docker, CI/CD principles, stateless SaaS application, and more. So there's, another article where you can go and read more about how to adopt the 12-factor methodology for any SaaS application on AWS. The multi-tenant SaaS architecture best practices, you want to do auto scaling with Amazon, you want to do database replication with Amazon RDS, Aurora or DynamoDB, you want to have your load balancer for your application, you want to include your CDN, CloudFront, if you're using the Amazon ecosystem. For your static content, use S3 to store all your static media and content. Caching system, which could be Redis or Memcached, or if you're using Amazon's ecosystem, then Amazon's Elastic Cache. And multi-availability zone setup for redundancy and availability. So there's all of that. And then there's your CI/CD pipelines, which could be Jenkins. And you need to consider those as to what happens when you do code releases, publish across the tenant. How do you manage your dev test, staging, and prod environments? So you need to take care of those environments and tenants. And if you follow up on the previous best practices, then it should not be difficult. The CI/CD practice is another world that your DevOps team needs to be familiar with. So there's, those, your CI/CD tools, Jenkins, Circle CI, or AWS code pipelines that you could be using. I'm not going to go through CI/CD pipeline building here. DevOps automation is the scripts or the processes or Terraform that you're using to automate the tenant creation process. If you're trying to stick to the Amazon ecosystem, then Amazon Cloud Formation or Ansible. Terraform is the recommended one for doing your automation of your tenant creation process. You can also write scripts like Chef scripts or Puppeteer scripts and things like that. Anyway, siloed compute and siloed storage. You need to keep in mind how are you storing things, how are you computing things. So come up with that strategy for your company. IAM roles per function or microservice, Amazon S3 security policies, VPC isolation, Amazon ECS, Kubernetes namespace isolation, database isolation, and so on. Tenant compute capacity. Have you ever wondered how many SaaS tenants can support per environment? So you can have, let's say, 99 tenants, compute database loads is almost to the limits. Do you have a ready environment to support new tenants? Things like this, right? So if you're running out of capacity and you need to add new tenants, what would you do? kind of have capacity planning and things like this for your scenarios. Cleaning up tenants, if a customer decides to no longer work with you, what do you do? Where do you keep the data? Do you back it up, archive it, clean it up? How do you delete the particular tenant from your production environments, staging, QA, and dev environments, and so on and so forth? These are all things that you need to think about when building your multi-tenant architecture. And so finally, some thoughts on the multi-tenant SaaS architecture. Is, how does it all work end to end? Server configurations, code, database layers, architecture pursues per every IT layer. How do different teams work together? There's no global solution, right? It's a conglomerate of different services and solutions that you need to put together and architect for your particular business. There are different variations of it. Things depend on your budgets, the complexities you can handle, the kind of teams you have, and so on. Definitely go for microservices, micro front ends, break things up, use the general principles of separating concerns, and so on. Cost efficiencies, agility, how quickly can you deploy new tenants, things like this that you need to consider. And of course, you want to consider what your customers want and what kind of things your organization can support. Get the buy-in from the DevOps teams, from the software engineering teams. Work with them to see what is suitable for your business, what languages are the developers experts and pros in, and what would make sense for your business. Look into what kind of compliances you need based on, are you collecting payments, how the size of your company, and things of that nature. And what kind of business you're in, right? If you're managing financial data or healthcare data, then you're going to have certain compliances that you need to take into consideration. FAQs, at this point you should know what is a single tenant, you should know what is a multi-tenant. A single tenant basically serves a single customer. The customer is basically the tenant, the client. And multi-tenant means that you have multiple clients and customers who are all on the same infrastructure, being served from the same infrastructure, centralized services. So that is essentially the multi-tenant architecture that you need to figure out of how do you put the infrastructure together, what is it composed of with services and tools and platforms. SaaS is basically software as a service, so you can get on-demand distribution of your software. And a SaaS application is an application hosted in the cloud, serves software rather than being physically on a computer, and it provides benefits like software updates, better security, and cost reduction. And that's it for this video and this article, and I hope you enjoyed this playlist and learned a bit about how to set up your multi-tenant architecture, namely with Amazon AWS.